You ever solve a problem perfectly and still end up completely wrong? You look at the data, you run the numbers, you follow the logical steps exactly as you were taught, and you arrive at a conclusion that makes perfect sense. You check your work twice, 3 times, maybe you even get someone else to verify it, and everything checks out. The logic is airtight, the reasoning is flawless, the conclusion is inevitable, and then reality hits you in the face and shows you that your perfect logical solution was completely disconnected from what's actually true. And you sit there stunned, confused, maybe even angry, because you did everything right according to the rules of logic. You followed the method. You avoided fallacies. You were rigorous and careful and precise, but somehow, somewhere, the logic led you astray. And now you're questioning everything. Because if perfect logic can give you wrong answers, then what can you trust? Here's what makes this even more maddening. You see people around you making decisions based on gut feelings, on intuition, on things they can't even explain rationally, and somehow they end up right more often than you do with all your careful analysis. They don't have spreadsheets, they don't have decision matrices, they don't spend hours weighing evidence and constructing arguments. They just know, and it works. Meanwhile, you're paralyzed by analysis, drowning in data, unable to move forward because you're trying to achieve logical certainty before you act. You've been taught that logic is the supreme tool for navigating reality, that reason is the highest human faculty, that if you just think hard enough and carefully enough, you'll arrive at truth. But that teaching is starting to feel like a lie, because the harder you try to logic your way through life, the more lost you become. But what if I told you that this exact problem was identified, analyzed, and solved by one of the greatest scientific minds in human history? A man who made revolutionary discoveries in mathematics, physics, and engineering before he turned 30. A man who literally invented new branches of science. A man who had more reason to trust pure logic than almost anyone who ever lived. And yet this same man, Blaise Pascal, spent the second half of his short life proving mathematically that mathematics has limits, demonstrating scientifically that science cannot reach the deepest truths, and using rigorous logic to show exactly where and why logic breaks down. He didn't abandon reason, he perfected it. And in perfecting it, he discovered its boundaries. He found the edge of what logic can do, and he showed us what lies beyond that edge. Pascal was born in 1,623 inches, Clermont-Ferrand, France. By age 12, he had independently discovered the first 32 propositions of Euclid's Elements. By 16, he wrote an essay on conic sections that René Descartes refused to believe was written by a teenager. By 18, he had invented and built the Pascaline, the world's first mechanical calculator. This wasn't a theoretical design. This was a working machine with 8 dials and gears that could add and subtract automatically. He built over 50 versions of it, constantly refining the mechanism, and as he built these calculating machines, he started asking a question that would eventually overturn everything. If a machine can calculate, if logic can be mechanized, if reasoning can be reduced to the turning of gears, then what separates human thought from mechanical operation? What makes us more than just complex calculators? So pay close attention right now, because what I'm about to show you is not some vague spiritual wisdom about trusting your feelings. This is mathematical precision. This is scientific rigor. This is Pascal using the exact tools of logic to reveal the exact limits of logic. He's going to show you where reason fails, why it fails, and what that failure means for how you should actually live your life. And if you've been stuck trying to reason your way into meaning, if you've been paralyzed by the need for logical certainty, if you've been feeling like something is missing, even when all your arguments are sound, then you need to see this. Because Pascal figured it out. He proved it mathematically. And then he lived it. And what he discovered will completely change how you think about thinking itself. In 1654, Pascal received a letter from a gambler named Chevalier de Marais. The letter posed a problem. If 2 players are in the middle of a game of chance, and the game gets interrupted before either player wins, how should they divide the pot fairly based on their chances of winning? This seems like a simple question, but nobody in history had solved it mathematically. Pascal started corresponding with Pierre de Fermat, another brilliant mathematician, And together they invented an entirely new branch of mathematics to solve this problem. They called it probability theory. And this changed everything. For the first time in human history, you could quantify uncertainty, you could assign numbers to chance, you could make rational decisions even when you didn't have complete information. Here's how it worked. Imagine the game is supposed to go to 5 points, and the game gets interrupted when player A has 3 points and player B has 2 points. Pascal showed that you could calculate all the possible ways the game could finish if it continued. Player A needs 2 more points to win. Player B needs 3 more points. So the maximum number of rounds needed is 4 more rounds. Pascal calculated that out of all 16 possible outcomes of those 4 rounds, player A wins in 11 scenarios and player B wins in 5 scenarios. Therefore, player A should get 11 over 16 of the pot and player B should get 5 over 16. This seems obvious now, but in 1654, this was revolutionary. Pascal had created a mathematical tool for navigating uncertainty. He had shown that you could use logic even when you don't have certainty. But here's where Pascal's genius really shows. He took this same tool, this probability theory he had just invented, and he applied it to the ultimate question, the question of God's existence. He created what's now known as Pascal's wager. And everyone misunderstands this. They think it's a cheap trick to scare people into belief with threats of hell, but it's not. It's a rigorous mathematical demonstration that even the question of God cannot be settled by logic alone. Here's the argument. You exist in a state of uncertainty about whether God exists. You cannot prove God exists. You cannot prove God doesn't exist. Logic alone cannot decide this question, but you must decide how to live. Refusing to choose is itself a choice. So you're making a bet whether you realize it or not. Now apply probability theory. If you bet that God exists and live accordingly, and God doesn't exist, you lose some finite pleasures in this finite life. If you bet God doesn't exist and live accordingly, and God doesn't exist, you gain those finite pleasures. So far, the outcomes are symmetrical, but now consider the other possibilities. If God does exist, and you bet correctly, you gain infinite eternal joy. If God does exist, and you bet incorrectly, you lose infinite eternal happiness. Now do the expected value calculation. Even if the probability of God's existence is extremely small, say 1 in a million, the expected value of betting on God is still infinite because infinity times any probability greater than 0 is still infinity. Therefore, pure rational self-interest dictates betting that God exists. And this is where everyone stops and says, Pascal is trying to calculate God like a gambling problem, but they're missing the entire point. The point is not that this argument should convince you to believe. The point is that this argument reveals the limits of convincing arguments. Because Pascal is showing you something profound. He's showing you that when you introduce infinity into your calculations, when you try to weigh infinite outcomes against finite ones, normal logic breaks down. You can't make this decision the way you make other decisions. The mathematics itself is revealing that there's something beyond mathematics at work here. Pascal is using probability theory to show you the edge of what probability theory can do. He's using logic to reveal logic's boundaries. Let me ask you something right now. You calculate your decisions or you just let life happen? Because here's what I see constantly. People either try to logic everything and end up paralyzed, or they give up on thinking entirely and just drift. And both approaches miss what Pascal discovered. There's a third way, a way that uses rigorous logical analysis where it applies and recognizes where it doesn't apply. And if you're stuck right now, if you're trying to make a major life decision and the logic isn't helping, I want you to understand something. The problem isn't that you're not smart enough. The problem is that you're trying to use the wrong tool. You're trying to calculate something that can't be calculated. And I want you to leave a comment right now. Just write, I want to see the patterns. Because that simple act, that admission that you're ready to see beyond pure calculation, that's the first step. Your comment helps this reach others who are trapped in analysis paralysis. It builds a community of people who understand that reality is bigger than reasoning. So do it now. Write, I want to see the patterns. Then come back, because we're about to go even deeper into Pascal's scientific discoveries. Now let me show you something even more remarkable. In 1646, Pascal heard about Evangelista Torricelli's experiments with vacuum tubes in Italy. For 2,000 years, philosophers had believed that nature abhors a vacuum, that empty space cannot exist. Aristotle had declared it impossible. But Torricelli had taken a glass tube about 1 meter long, sealed at one end, filled it with mercury, and inverted it into a basin of mercury. The mercury in the tube dropped to about 76 centimeters and stopped, leaving empty space at the top. Torricelli claimed this space was a true vacuum. Others said it was filled with invisible mercury vapors. Nobody could prove it either way. Pascal saw an opportunity. He reasoned that if Torricelli was right, if the mercury column was being held up by atmospheric pressure, then the height of the column should decrease as you go higher in elevation where there's less atmosphere above you. In 1648, Pascal convinced his brother-in-law, Florin Perrier, to climb Puy de Dôme, a mountain in central France, carrying a barometer. Perrier took measurements at the base of the mountain at 5 different points going up, and at the summit, at the base, the mercury stood at 71.14 centimeters. At the summit, 1,465 meters higher, it stood at 62.74 centimeters, a difference of 8.4 centimeters. The higher you went, the less atmospheric pressure, the lower the mercury column. Pascal had proven the vacuum exists. He had proven that we live at the bottom of an ocean of air that presses down on us with measurable force. But here's what's extraordinary. Pascal didn't stop with the physical discovery. He immediately saw the metaphysical implications. He wrote that just as we live under the weight of an immense ocean of air without perceiving it, we live under the weight of existence itself without perceiving it. Just as there's a physical pressure we can measure with mercury and glass, there's an existential pressure, a weight of being that we feel but cannot quantify. The vacuum he proved physically became for him a symbol of the vacuum he felt spiritually. The empty space at the top of the tube pointed to the empty space in the human heart, and the atmospheric pressure that fills every space pointed to something that should fill the spiritual vacuum but doesn't. Pascal made other crucial discoveries in physics. He formulated what's now called Pascal's principle in hydrostatics, which states that pressure applied to a confined fluid is transmitted undiminished in all directions. This is the principle behind hydraulic systems, car brakes, elevators, heavy machinery. Pascal proved this through precise experiments with fluids in containers of different shapes. He showed that a small force applied over a small area can generate a large force over a large area if you use fluids to transmit the pressure. This is pure physics, but Pascal saw in it something about the human condition, that small pressures, small anxieties, small fears, when they accumulate and distribute through the confined space of a human life, become crushing forces that immobilize us. In 1653, Pascal wrote his Treatise on the Equilibrium of Liquids and Treatise on the Weight of the Mass of Air. These were rigorous scientific works full of experiments, measurements, and mathematical proofs. He calculated that atmospheric pressure at sea level is approximately 101,325 pascals. Yes, the unit of pressure is named after him. 1 pascal equals 1 Newton per square meter. He showed that this pressure decreases exponentially with altitude, according to what we now call the barometric formula. He was doing sophisticated physics that wouldn't be fully formalized until Newton. And yet, even in these dry scientific treatises, Pascal kept making connections to human existence. He kept asking what these physical laws reveal about metaphysical realities. And then something happened that changed everything. On the night of the 23rd of November, 1654, from approximately 10:30 p.m. to 12:30 a.m., Pascal had an experience he described as an encounter with fire. He wrote it down on a piece of parchment in fragmentary, ecstatic phrases. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and of the scholars. Certitude, certitude, feeling, joy, peace. He sewed this parchment, which he called his memorial, into the lining of his coat. He transferred it to each new coat he wore. He carried it against his heart every day for the remaining 8 years of his life. It was only discovered after his death, and it marks a radical turning point. After this night, Pascal largely stopped doing mathematics and physics. He devoted himself to defending the Christian faith and exploring what he called the reasons of the heart. But notice what happened. Pascal didn't abandon science. He didn't renounce logic. He didn't become anti-rational. He simply recognized that science and logic, as powerful as they are, cannot reach the deepest questions, cannot touch the most important realities. He had spent years proving things rigorously, proving that vacuums exist, proving that air has weight, proving that probability can be calculated. And every proof led him to the same conclusion. That proof itself has limits, that there are truths that cannot be proven but must be encountered, that there are ways of knowing beyond logical demonstration. In his later work, The Pensées, Pascal wrote this famous fragment: "The heart has its reasons, which reason does not know." And again, everyone misunderstands this. They think he's saying emotion trumps logic, but that's not it at all. Pascal is making a precise epistemological claim. He's saying there are different modes of knowing. Logic operates discursively, moving step by step from premises to conclusions, but the heart knows immediately, directly, intuitively. For example, you know you exist not through Descartes' "I think therefore I am" argument, but through immediate self-awareness. Space has three dimensions, not through proof, but through direct perception. First principles like the law of non-contradiction, not because you can prove them, but because you grasp them immediately and use them to prove other things. These are the heart's reasons, direct apprehensions of truth that make logical reasoning possible. Pascal argues that the most important truths work this way. You don't prove that life has meaning and then decide to find it meaningful. You grasp directly that meaning is real, and that grasp grounds everything else. You don't prove that other people have inner lives like yours and then decide to treat them ethically. You perceive their personhood immediately, and ethics follows. You don't prove that beauty exists and then appreciate beauty. You experience beauty directly, and that experience is self-validating. And most importantly for Pascal, you don't prove God exists and then enter relationship. You encounter God directly, and that encounter gives you certainty that no argument could provide. But here's the crucial part. Pascal never says the heart's reasons are superior to logical reasons. He says they're different. They operate in different domains. And a fully functioning human being needs both. You need logic to navigate the physical world, to build machines, to do science, to make technology work. But you need the heart's reasons to navigate meaning, purpose, relationships, ultimate questions. And the disaster of modern life, Pascal saw, is that we've tried to make logic do everything. We've tried to calculate meaning, optimize purpose, quantify love, prove the unprovable. And it doesn't work. It can't work. It will never work. Let me show you one more scientific achievement that illustrates this perfectly. In 1642, when Pascal built the Pascaline, he was trying to help his father, who was a tax commissioner. His father had to do endless calculations adding up tax receipts. It was tedious, time-consuming, error-prone. So Pascal, at 18, built a machine to do it automatically. The Pascaline had 8 dials representing different decimal places. When one dial completed a full rotation, it would automatically carry over to the next dial, just like you do when adding by hand. It was mechanical genius. It used clicking ratchets to prevent the dials from turning backward. It was the first digital calculator in history. But as Pascal watched this machine work, he realized something disturbing. The machine could calculate perfectly. It never made errors in arithmetic. It followed logical rules flawlessly. But it had no understanding of what it was doing. It didn't know it was calculating taxes. It didn't know what money was. It didn't know why calculation mattered. It just turned gears according to mechanical necessity. And Pascal asked, are humans like this? Are we just more complex versions of this machine, following rules we don't understand toward purposes we can't grasp? Or is there something about human consciousness, about understanding, about knowing, that's fundamentally different from mechanical operation? And this is where Pascal's whole project comes together. Science showed him that huge domains of reality can be understood mechanically, mathematically, logically. Physics is law-governed. Mathematics is rule-based. Nature operates according to principles we can discover and formalize, and that's beautiful. That's powerful. Pascal celebrated this. He contributed to it massively. But he also saw that if you try to explain everything this way, if you reduce all of reality to mechanism and calculation, you lose exactly what makes reality worth understanding in the first place. You lose meaning, purpose, value, beauty, love. All the things that make life worth living cannot be captured in equations or mechanized in gears. You know what's wild? Right now, in 2026, we're living through the exact crisis Pascal predicted. We have more computing power than Pascal could have dreamed of. We can calculate things he never imagined. We have artificial intelligence that can solve problems, generate text, analyze data with superhuman efficiency, and yet we're more confused than ever about meaning, more anxious, more depressed, more uncertain about purpose, because we've built a civilization that's incredibly good at calculation and incredibly bad at the things calculation cannot reach. We can optimize everything except what matters. We can measure everything except what gives measurement meaning. We're drowning in logic and starving for the heart's reasons. And I need to pause here and tell you something important. If you're still watching, if you're still engaged with this, that means something. It means some part of you recognizes what Pascal discovered. That pure logic isn't enough. That rigorous science, as beautiful and necessary as it is, cannot answer the questions you actually care about most. And if that's resonating with you, I want you to take action. I want you to subscribe to this channel, not as a passive consumer of content, but as an active participant in recovering what we've lost. This channel is dedicated to exploring the full range of human knowing, logic and intuition, science and meaning, calculation and encounter. When you subscribe, you're choosing to develop both sides. You're refusing to be just a calculating machine. You're insisting on being a whole person. So do it now. Hit that subscribe button. Join a community that understands reality is richer than rationalism allows. And let's figure out together what it means to think with both the head and the heart. After his Night of Fire in 1654, Pascal had 8 more years to live. He died in 1662 at age 39. Those final 8 years were marked by chronic illness and constant pain, but they were also marked by intense intellectual and spiritual productivity. He wrote the Provincial Letters, a series of 18 brilliant satirical letters defending Jansenist theology against Jesuit casuistry. These letters are considered masterpieces of French prose. They're funny, biting, logically devastating. Pascal used all his rhetorical and logical skill to defend what he saw as authentic Christianity against corruption. And he began writing what would become the Pensées, fragments for a planned apology for the Christian religion that he never finished. These fragments are extraordinary. Some are single sentences, some are several pages. But they all share this quality of piercing insight into the human condition. Pascal describes humans as caught between two infinites, the infinitely large and the infinitely small. We're huge compared to atoms, but microscopic compared to galaxies. We have the capacity for rational thought, for understanding the universe, which makes us godlike. But we also have the capacity for stupidity, self-deception, cruelty, which makes us wretched. We're walking contradictions, great and miserable simultaneously. Pascal argues that you cannot understand this paradox unless you understand that humans are fallen creatures made for something higher. We have traces of our original nobility, which is why we're capable of reason and goodness, but we also bear the marks of our corruption, which is why we constantly fail to live up to what we know we should be. And this creates the fundamental dynamic of human existence. We know we should be better than we are. We glimpse heights we cannot reach. We feel the absence of something we've never possessed. And so we distract ourselves. We fill our lives with what Pascal calls divertissement, diversion, entertainment, busyness, anything to avoid sitting alone in a quiet room confronting the reality of our condition. And here's Pascal's diagnosis of why logic alone fails. Logic can show you that your life is inconsistent. It can reveal contradictions in your beliefs. It can demonstrate that your current path leads nowhere. But logic cannot give you the power to change. It cannot fill the void. It cannot bridge the gap between what you know you should do and what you actually do. Because the problem isn't lack of information, the problem is lack of transformation. And transformation doesn't come from better arguments. It comes from encounter with something, someone beyond yourself. It comes from what Pascal experienced that November night. Direct contact with the living God who fills the vacuum, relieves the pressure, resolves the paradox. But notice, Pascal never abandoned his scientific achievements. He never said his work on probability was worthless or his experiments on pressure were meaningless. He saw them as true in their domain, useful for their purposes, but limited in their scope. Physics can tell you how atmospheric pressure works. It cannot tell you why you feel existentially crushed. Mathematics can calculate probabilities. It cannot give you certainty about ultimate things. Logic can expose contradictions. It cannot provide the grace to live consistently. Each tool is perfect for its purpose and disastrous when misapplied. This is what Pascal is warning us about across 370 years. Not that logic is bad, but that logic alone deceives, because it promises what it cannot deliver. It promises that if you just think carefully enough, analyze thoroughly enough, calculate precisely enough, you'll arrive at truth and meaning and purpose and fulfillment. But you won't. You'll arrive at accurate descriptions of limited domains, you'll get correct answers to answerable questions, and you'll still be empty inside. Because the deepest questions aren't answerable by logic. They're answerable by encounter, by direct experience, by the heart's immediate grasp of realities that transcend calculation. And this brings us to where you are right now, today. You've been taught to trust logic supremely, to value scientific thinking above all else, to dismiss anything that can't be measured, quantified, proven. And that education has given you real gifts. You can think critically. You can spot fallacies. You can analyze evidence. These are good things. But that same education has also impoverished you because it's taught you to ignore or dismiss the heart's reasons, the direct intuitions of meaning and purpose and value that don't fit into logical frameworks, the immediate experiences of transcendence that can't be reduced to data, the encounters with beauty and love and mystery that make life worth living but can't be captured in equations. Pascal lived this tension at the highest possible level. He was one of the greatest mathematical minds in history, and he concluded that mathematics has limits. He was a revolutionary physicist, and he concluded that physics cannot reach the most important realities. He invented probability theory, and he used it to show that the ultimate questions cannot be resolved by calculation. He lived at the peak of logical achievement and discovered that the peak is not the summit, that there are heights beyond heights, truths beyond proofs, ways of knowing that transcend demonstration. So what does this mean for you, practically? It means you stop demanding logical certainty before you engage with ultimate questions. It means you develop the capacity to know things immediately, intuitively, through that direct perception Pascal called the heart's reasons. It means you use logic as a tool, a valuable tool, an essential tool, but just a tool. Not a god, not a master, not the final arbiter of all truth. You use it where it works. You recognize where it doesn't work. And you cultivate other ways of knowing for domains where logic cannot reach. And yes, this is uncomfortable. This requires you to admit that you don't have complete control through pure reasoning, that you can't calculate your way to certainty about everything, that you have to risk, trust, encounter, experience, that you have to be vulnerable to realities beyond your logical frameworks. But that discomfort is precisely the point, because the alternative is what you've been doing, trying to logic your way through life and ending up paralyzed, confused, empty despite having all the right arguments. Pascal is offering you a different path, not anti-logical, but translogical, not rejecting reason, but recognizing what lies beyond reason. 370 years ago, one of the smartest people who ever lived used all his scientific genius to show us where science stops. He used mathematical precision to reveal mathematics' boundaries. He used rigorous logic to demonstrate logic's limits. And he did it not to destroy these tools, but to save us from worshiping them, to free us from the tyranny of pure reason, to open our eyes to fuller, deeper, richer ways of engaging with reality. He warned us that logic alone will deceive us, that calculation cannot capture what matters most, that we need both head and heart, both reason and intuition, both science and encounter. And then he died at 39, carrying that parchment from the night of fire sewn into his coat, pressed against his heart, testifying to what he found when logic reached its edge and the heart found its home. He tried to tell us. We ignored him. And now, centuries later, we're finally starting to understand what he was saying all along.